Welcome, everyone, to the January 2022 textual study on the Bible and Beyond discussions. I'm your host, Shirley Paulson, and our presenter this evening is Dr. Hal Taussig. In this study tonight, our topic is, were there any Christians in the first 2 centuries? We'll take a close look at the most controversial part of the new book, After Jesus, Before Christianity. For the most part, both biblical scholars and most churches have not paid attention to the almost complete lack of the word Christian and the complete lack of the word Christianity in the Bible itself. We'll examine the 3 small mentions of Christian in the eventual New Testament to see how they help us understand the situation. I want to mention, before we turn it over to Hal, that we encourage and appreciate an ongoing pledge of support via Patreon. As we continue to grow and provide more and better services, our expenses are growing too. So we do need your help. If you can, please go to patreon.com/Bible and Beyond to make the monthly pledge that's just right for you. You can also upgrade your monthly payments to help us with these increasing expenses. PayPal or checks are also an option if you prefer. And really, thanks so much. Okay, Hal, it's all yours. Eager to hear what you've got to tell us tonight.
Thanks so much, Shirley. And we're really honored to have you all here with us for these 4 sessions throughout 4 months on Monday evenings. And we thank you for this. We are looking at this book, which has 20 chapters in it. And we're spending 4 hours on it. That doesn't quite match up in terms of math. 4 into 20 basically means we haven't covered what we need to. But we want to tonight do a very special thing. We want to see approach what we think is probably the most controversial part of the book, After Jesus, Before Christianity. But we've waited until the 3rd session, mainly because we think that there are probably more important things in this book than the most controversial. And so the first session that we did, we took a look at what we thought were the 6 most important discoveries about the first 2 centuries of the Common Era and the Jesus people. And we looked at those 6 most important discoveries that have not really been looked at very much in other approaches to the first 2 centuries. So for instance, we looked at how the Jesus people, many kinds of Jesus people, resisted the Roman Empire. Very important discovery. And again, this was not simply the Westar seminar that did this, but all kinds of scholars who have been for the last 30 or 40 years working on these things. A next discovery in the larger scholarship is they practiced, meaning the Jesus peoples practiced gender bending. Thirdly, they lived in chosen families, not blood families by and large. They claimed to belong, they claimed a belonging to Israel. 5th discovery, they had diverse organizational practices and structures. That is, not all of the different Jesus groups of the first 2 centuries at all had the same structures. And finally, they had persisting oral traditions. So that was what we did in our first session. And in the second, we looked at this very important topic of Roman violence in the first 2 centuries and how much that had clear importance for the various kinds of Jesus peoples. So we have done that, and now today, as Shirley's already said, we're taking on the question of what about what does it mean that basically the word Christian and Christianity hardly is used in the first 2 centuries of all of these Jesus peoples? And so we want to look straight at that, because by and large, both scholars and churches have decided to ignore that, or maybe just wish they weren't reading it, or something like that. So we want to talk about this as to how important is it or is it not that for the first 200 years, remember the first 200 years, that would be about as long as the United States of America has existed. The first 200 years, hardly anyone was using the word Christian. And when they did use the word Christian, it didn't mean a religion, a big religion. It meant some other things. So we want to think about that together tonight, and we have some ways that the book has approached this. But before we get there, I want to just take a little bit of time to hear from you about this. In other words, I have been, as one of the writers, I have been in a lot of conversation around the country already in the last 2 months about this issue of the Christian or not so Christian character of the first 2 centuries. And so I would like to just ask you all at the beginning of our session today, whether you think it matters that probably about 100,000 people in the first 2 centuries didn't think of themselves as Christian and didn't use the term Christian or Christianity except rarely. So in other words, my question to you is, should we just not talk about that? Should we talk about it? How much does the word Christian mean to you now? Whether you are a Christian or not, I know from our group that some folks aren't Christian, and that always helps our conversation. I think that we're diverse in that regard. But I'd love, Christian or not, whether you now think that it's significant in one way or another that it looks like the words were not used, Christian and Christianity, except rarely. So I'm going to stop here and just have you muse for a moment. Anybody who wants to talk about that in terms of just whether it matters to you, how and why.
When you pose that question, Hal, the first thing that pops into my mind is I'm probably Christian because they didn't use that word then.
And say a little bit more,
Karen.
Karen.
Being part of what the church has come as representative Christian, I have to go way back to early Christian texts and these understandings and the fact that that the church and what it meant to be a follower, it was very different and organic. And that's been what's held me in the church these last many years, is that's the kind of Christian I want to be.
Thank you. I see Julio saying, wasn't Christian at first a derogatory category? And frankly, scholars aren't completely sure about that, but the word that is the answer to you, Julio, is probably yes. That is, again, we don't really know, and this is why we don't really know, is, for instance, in the entire New Testament, and we will look at this a little bit later, the entire New Testament, 138,000 words, only has 3 words that say Christian. In other words, it practically was not used. And it could be because we have 1 or 2 documents of the Romans using Christian as basically a slander, or even more, the name of someone who might be illegal, or who you might have to punish in one way or another. So there's a decent chance that the word Christian, in the rare times it is used by Jesus people, that it's used ironically.
I believe.
Again, more to hear from you all as to when you think about this 200 years of its for coming into being. The Jesus peoples didn't seem to matter much whether they called themselves Christians, or most of them probably just didn't think about it.
I never thought of the possibility that in the book of Acts, where it said they first called Paul a Christian in Antioch, that it's actually could be derogatory. Never thought of that possibility ever. I thought it was like, oh, he's a good Christian. Doesn't say the word good Christian. Just says Christian. So you've raised I just love this discussion. It's really awesome for me.
Yep, thanks.
And Hal, you see there's a question in the chat. All right, well, I'll read it to you. It just says, is there any use of the phrase Christian nationalism in any form?
In as much as the word Christian has meanings in those first 2 centuries, it has almost nothing to do with nationalism. In other words, it's not. It basically has, nor does it have anything to do with religion. It looks like it may have to do with some Jesus peoples who actually saw themselves as politically opposing the Roman Empire. That's one of our guesses, but again, we don't have much to guess on when you only have 3 times its use in much of the first 2 centuries. You don't want to take yourself too seriously about that.
And Philip says, I sometimes have difficulty with the label Christian because of the huge spectrum of activity today, much of which I find at odds with the exemplar in the Bible and other non-canonical texts.
Yeah, so that's really also, if I understood correctly, both the underlying part of what you were getting at, Karen, that so it has because there's so many people using the word now, millions, in different ways, it's not exactly clear what it means today. And this evening, when we are looking at this, we're going to mostly be looking at it historically in those first 2 centuries. It would be more than an hour of conversation, I think, if we were talking about what the millions and millions of people variously mean about it. Anyone want to get in on this now before we'll have a chance to come back to it, but anybody want to just say what's going on in your head or heart when you think of the first 200 years in that way?
Well, I wonder how often did Jesus use the word Christ? Because that's where the word Christian comes from.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yes, the notion of being a Christian comes from the word Christ, I guess, in English. And I agree with what Phil's saying. I struggle with that often. Somebody asks me, and I feel like, I'm a Christian, but
Yeah.
You know, I'm different in this way or whatever. You feel like saying it, but of course I don't. But
I would recommend looking at. We have a lot of that in the first and second and 17th chapters of the book. So we won't be able to cover that all. But yes, it is briefly the key thing that not just our work in this book, but generally scholarship has been clear about is the meaning of Christ. And that also has not much at all to do with the word Christ in our day. But the word Christ, of course, is just the Greek word for anointed one. It's literally the Greek word for to be anointed. And that has a big variety of meaning in the first 2 centuries. In other words, anointed, the people that are anointed, for instance, in Israel at that time are prophets, kings, and priests, occasionally teachers. So it doesn't solve a lot of those problems. The Christians later have said, "Oh, Christ means the Messiah." That's just one of 3 to 5 important different meanings for Christ at that time.
So I'm sorry, there are several questions that have come in now. Since you asked, we have them. So I'll go ahead and just give them to you here. Helen is saying, is there any evidence in the patristic texts of the use of Christian in the first 2 centuries?
Well, thank you. Patristics is mainly probably not in the first 2 centuries. It's a very interesting thing. That is, the patristics really are mostly at formative later, maybe the very last part of the 2nd century, a bit. But most of the patristics would be in the 3rd and 4th century, and yes, they're using it like crazy, and they're not all meaning the same thing.
That's helpful. All right, and Janice Hunt Johnson says, a rabbi friend of mine says more than one person in the Bible was Christ, including King David. It simply means anointed, as you've been saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. And then Julio comes back and says, there was no Christ until Paul invented it? Question mark.
Mm-hmm. No, the word Christ, the word Christos in Greek comes from basically not just people related to Israel, but it's a Greek word for all kinds of different nationalities and empires using the word to be anointed into some kind of authority. So no, the word Christos goes further back than the New Testament at all. It's just that they used it occasionally in the same way most other nationalities or identities did to say, oh, that's a person who got oil poured or rubbed on their head as a designation of some kind of importance.
Okay, that's all the questions for now.
Okay, thanks. We'll come back at that. But Shirley, you offered to read us a little bit of the book that gets into this, and you're going to take little snippets of them, and then we'll talk about each of them.
Sure. All right. Happy to do that. I'll be sharing my screen here.
So you said Christos was the Greek word. Is that what would have primarily been used then? Was in Greek, or were there other languages similar to Greek?
Yeah, no, there are several other languages. Mashiach, for instance, is the Hebrew word, except Hebrew was a dead language at the time in the 1st and 2nd century. Rarely is Mashiach used. There is a bit of Mashiach in the First Testament of the Hebrew Scriptures, and then yes, throughout, since in the whole Mediterranean, Rome had conquered everything. Most of the languages are either Latin or Greek.
My question is more, were there other derivatives that you could identify as coming from Christos rather than another name, a completely different, letters forming a different name? Was there different ways that Christos was said, or do we know? We probably don't know, but
no, we know a lot about that. That is a good question, and I would say there's as I meant to have said before. It's such a broad term. It's not like Christians now treat it as being really, really special in one kind of person. I mean, look at, even in your day, look at the priests and look at the prophets. Are they doing the same thing? Often not at all.
So I don't know Greek, but would there be equivalent to Christ-like, Christ, all the different ways?
No, basically, Christ isn't somebody's name, it's somebody's title.
So somebody's a doctor, you call him a physician, you call him other things, but I'm just trying to understand if the word Christos, if the word itself got somehow developed that caused it to evolve into Christian.
I think let's look at some of the things that Shirley's going to read about this and come back to it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we're starting off with this one. When we survey the first 2 centuries of the Common Era, these peoples organized themselves into communities, clubs, groups of followers, and schools. They called themselves a variety of names: the enslaved of God, the body of the anointed, brothers and sisters, the way. They strongly identified with the traditions of Israel and often thought of themselves as part of Israel. Well, let's see here. These peoples had no single name for themselves, but a variety of names, and sometimes no name. The use of the term Christian was very rare, with no certain occurrence in the first century. Our first challenge then is figuring out what to call them, given that they did not call themselves Christian or Christians. Previous scholarship has sometimes understood this problem, but has never addressed it. The name Christian is still used to identify these diverse peoples, even with the acknowledgement that the word does not apply.
Okay, let's just let that sink in and see what protests or questions or thoughts that you might have.
Anita is saying, assuming that there are multiple traditions in terms of thinking about Jesus in the first 2 centuries, is there any understanding of how they related to each other when coming in contact?
Yeah, there is. By and large, they weren't coming in contact. That is one of the main things that in our book became clear, is there was no central leader or set of leaders. By and large, all of these groups were quite small and spread out over most of the entire Mediterranean basin. The one thing that I think does apply to your question is that it looks like there's one thing that they all do across all kinds of different names, different thoughts, different practices. But we're pretty sure that the one thing, all these mostly little groups of less than 10, maybe up to 50 or something like that, what everybody did is every week or so, they all got together for a very big meal that took hours. It was full of drinking wine eating as much as you could get. Most of those people were trying to get food and were not getting enough, and so the meals were long but not really big in terms of eating a lot. But they also talked a lot, they sang a lot, they argued a lot, they prayed a lot. So we've got texts which say they went all night in some cases. So I think if you really want to say what's below the surface of the names, it's them talking a lot of politics, religion, relationships, economics among themselves in a way that they mostly listened to each other and occasionally had fights.
Hal, can I ask you a quick question? When you mention that, are you talking about them all meeting together in one place or lots of people meeting together in different places?
Oh, thanks, Jacqueline. I am sorry for the not saying that correctly. I can't believe that I have 4 books on early Christ people's meals and didn't say that. No, we have a whole bunch of the architecture of it, and they're either rooms, dining rooms, or often people's homes. Now, the thing about people's homes there is it would be about, and we have so many of these homes that we can even go and look at now. Those homes are probably maybe 14 feet by 15 feet. And so you can think that maybe you would get 20 people, but the cool and interesting thing is, of course, the way people ate in that era was to lie down together. So clearly, we even have furniture that we looked at, and often the furniture are couches in which at least 2 people are lying on the same couch, eating and drinking together.
And with their faces toward the table and their feet away from the table, right?
It was in a circle.
Yeah, but their feet were away from the table.
The feet were, I'm not sure anybody was worrying a lot about feet.
Well, I'm just trying to figure out where their bodies were. That's all. That's okay.
Oh, they're on the couches.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the couches are basically around the outside of the room.
Okay.
But I feel like I didn't get your question.
I was just trying to envision how the people are eating on couches. That's all.
Or how they got close to the table.
And by the way, in the book, there's a picture of it.
Yes. All right. Another question is from Lisa Joy, who says, what did Jesus mean to them? Why are they called Jesus people?
Oh, that's so helpful. Thank you. This is a fraud of our book. They did not call themselves Jesus peoples by and large at all. And we're going to get to some of the things they did call us. We mentioned a few of them earlier. But we couldn't figure out, in writing a 330-page book, about all these different groups that are related somewhat, but not always intensely, to Jesus or the name of Jesus. No, we don't. We actually have no names of groups that say we're the Jesus groups. This was a fraud on our part, meaning we wanted since by and large churches and scholars say, oh, those are the Christians, those are the early Christians. So we had to say, oh, wait a minute, we know that that's a bigger fraud. We had wonderful fights, the three of us that were writing, and the 20 of the seminar leaders. We had great arguments about what to call them. And some of our seminar people, for instance, said, oh, let's just call them Christian. But we did vote against that in deciding we're hoping to get some new perspectives.
So going back to the question about how they knew each other, Janice Hunt Johnson asks, didn't Jesus followers need to stay under the radar, so to speak? So they used the fish symbol to find each other?
Could you read that again, Shirley?
Sorry. Didn't Jesus followers need to stay under the radar, so to speak? So they used the fish symbol to find each other?
By and large, the answer to that is no. That is, we have a little bit of fishes around as symbols, but there's not a lot of them. Where we have things, it doesn't seem to be necessarily fish related, and of course, fish related is just a secret symbol. But and then the second part of the question is also really important, and that is, were they hiding out? And the answer there is occasionally somewhat, but the way peoples in that day all around the Mediterranean basin had their meals was in places that were quite open. So, for instance, all of the texts talk about mostly little houses or rooms rented from someplace. And much of those were not hideouts. In other words, most of them you could walk right in. Because as you'll see when you look at architecture, you'll see a lot of them are built for warm weather.
And now we have a question. Go ahead.
I have a thought about something. We've talked about the inclusivity with the gender and with being an inclusive group of people, these Jesus people. I like that term, by the way. I wonder, with that sense of inclusivity, they may have resisted wanting to call themselves Christians, the anointed ones. Or, like many religions today have some sort of exclusivity, whether it's one religion that says the only church, legitimate church on the planet is theirs, or there's the chosen people with another one. There's a lot of different exclusivity in that. And I'm thinking, as we're discussing this, I'm wondering maybe they didn't want to be labeled anointed is a definition of Christian. And it seems to me that, you say
I think
it seems to be the purest term to say the Jesus people, because I presume they talked about Jesus and they talked about what his teachings were trying to live his way. Am I right in assuming that without reading your book?
Thank you. Well, I think there is quite a bit to what you're saying about not wanting necessarily to use the anointed as a particular, because that calls attention to oneself. So I think there's something to that. But another thing is just to remember, by and large, these people aren't religious. In other words, we Christians, I'm a Christian now, we Christians now know that Christian is a huge religion. But it's not at all clear that, and this is one of the main things why we started with what they were doing. There's not much of well, actually, by and large, people that were, if we would call them religious, in a variety of ways, not just related to Jesus or one another. Religions as such come a little bit later in the Mediterranean basin.
If all the associations in the first 2 centuries are doing what these groups are doing, meeting together to meet and eat, why would anyone be attracted to these Jesus groups? What distinguished these groups?
Yeah, I think there I would point to our second session together, and that is what is happening in the larger society, and that is the Roman Empire is massively violent against all the people that it has conquered. And so in our 20th chapter in our book, in our summary, we say that the main thing they're doing getting together is being safe. That is, they are, and we said last week, for instance, that probably every family in the Mediterranean had somebody in their family killed, meaning crucified. So in other words, Rome was just venomous in what it was doing to the people it had conquered. So I want to say for our work, we would probably say the main thing that brought them together is fear and a place where people were finding joy anyway.
Okay, now there's a question from Joan. Isn't there somewhere in writings attributed to Paul that uses the word bishop or some other religion title? Would this be an elected position, or were they self-appointed?
That's wonderful. The word bishop and deacon are used fairly rarely in the text, but are used. The word bishop is also kind of a weird thing that happened in Christianity later. The word bishop actually means administrator, kind of one level above the person that has to do everything for the little groups. And the reason, for instance, I guess we have a hard time dating some of these texts, but somewhere into the 3rd or 4th decade of the 2nd century, that word bishop occasionally happens. But it looks like it's somebody going around to some little groups and trying to help them be somewhat organized. So that, yes, there is a little bit of that. And Shirley, would you read a few more of these slides?
Okay. The New Testament's 27 books contained approximately 138,015 words in Greek. Among these, approximately, 100, the same number, I guess, Christianos is found only 3 times. A comparison with other important words in the New Testament is revealing. Jesus is found 1,002 times. Mary is found 54 times. Israel is found 71 times. Judean, Jew, which is the same word in Greek, is found 147 times. Disciples or students, which is also the same word in Greek, is found 241 times. Paul is found 169 times. Believers, or those who trust, which is also the same word in Greek, is found 65 times.
So this gives a little bit more of a picture of what words are used. So again, here, I just would want to suggest, especially looking at something like, and we'll look at this a little bit more in terms of disciples. Disciples is in our terms, not anything like what it meant. Disciple is simply straight up student, sometimes informal student. The verbal form of disciple means people who learn. And that, in other words, probably the most important word in this in who you are is somebody who learns. Since most of those people don't read, they're not reading books to learn, they're talking with each other to learn. Why don't we go right on to the next disciple
Right.
phrases?
The word Christianos never appears in the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, nor does it appear in the letters of Paul. Thus, it is not a significant word in the vocabulary of the movements associated with those who belong to the party of the anointed. Many people identified with Jesus as a teacher while he was alive and after his death. With Jesus as their teacher, these people identified as students. The primary word for student on Greek is translated as disciple. In contemporary English, however, disciple does not mean student. Disciple is an ecclesiastical translation that sounds biblical and therefore out of the ordinary. The best translation is student, as it's the most frequently used name for followers of Jesus anointed in the first 2 centuries. When we read the Gospels in English, substituting the more accurate student for the backwards-looking ecclesiastical translation of disciple, suddenly the writings feel different. New potential for meaning opens up.
Let me just add a little bit here. So again, thinking that what these people are doing is eating, drinking, talking together, and learning. That, of course, means that no wonder that many different little groups go in different directions. Because what they like most to do is to find somebody to talk to about what's going on in their lives, especially including the fact that in many cases, what's going on in their lives is their son just got crucified.
So that brings us back to the question you were talking about before, Hal, when you said it was safer to be in this group as well as learning. One of the other questions is, why would a person be safer in a Jesus group than in the other group that congregates?
Yeah, that is so helpful in the way that question is framed, because in America now, to be safe means to be protected from somebody else's violence outside. There's simply no chance for that. You have soldiers everywhere. You have violence in all kinds of places all the time. That's by the state. So there is no hiding from this. There's simply a chance. What is safe is people who love each other, who like to talk with each other, who spend time with each other, and who try to learn together. In other words, think about if we can get outside our American box of saying we need more things to protect us, and think about what makes us safe inside ourselves. Would be a key way of thinking about what they're doing. In other words, they know that somebody's going to be after them when they step outside. And it's clear that some people come inside to harass them. But they keep doing this because when they care for each other, when they take time to talk with each other regularly, when they thrive on learning how to think about life in this kind of setting, that's what keeps bringing them back. And it's not really, and we know that there's not much food there anyway. They are probably at least if one would bring it down to what you put inside you, it'd be more like the wine. But that's, I think, a really good way of us noticing that safety for our cultures means something quite different, I think, than safety then. By the way, the word salvation in both testaments of the Bible, Hebrew and Christian, the word salvation is mainly about about getting out of a jam. It's not going to heaven. It's getting out of a jam that is salvific for instance, the Hebrews, because they're always the little nation around with a lot of big nations around them. So when they say, hey, God saved us, it means we won a battle.
Would participation in these groups be based primarily on familial or friend relationships rather than any discussion of the significance of Jesus?
I want to say a lot of that. I want to agree with much of that question, but I want to also say that one of the things we, in the 10 years that we studied this, found out is that families were falling apart all over the place, mostly because Rome was breaking them up to take away people and make them slaves in some other place, and mostly because of the lack of enough food and money for people in families, and families, by the way, were multiple families, meaning that not just the nuclear family that Americans think about. But what happened was, in one of the big things that brought Jesus peoples together to eat and drink and learn was building new kinds of family, and this is what we called chosen families, not blood families. So, for instance, Paul, it looks like, brought a lot of young people together who had already ran away from home, and said, now you be family, and notice what your leader, Jesus, and the like want to do is have you love one another as you live together. You know, we are doing so well in talking to each other that it's almost over. Shirley, why don't you read the rest of those? And
so vocabulary drawn from the school environment is frequent. Jesus is often called a teacher, and drawing on this association, he is also called wisdom, because he personified the wisdom characteristics of teachers. The followers of Jesus, the wise teacher, are the wise ones, or potentially the wise women, given wisdom's general gendered identity. Seminar member Brandon Scott gave Christian, a name applied to Jesus followers, a new 21st century clarity. What emerges from his work is a wide set of evocative group names from Jesus's connections to kingship and prophet. When groups proclaimed Jesus as anointed one, that placed him in a role as a king or prophet of Israel over and against Rome's claims. Imagining Jesus as anointed king or prophet makes him a national figure of Israel, which then features Jesus groups as the followers of such a national figure, of such a national anti-Roman leader. When they were called adherents of the party of the anointed one, party would be read as a party or group making claims of a political nature. More variations of groups or Jesus movements came to expression in names like believers of the anointed, confidence of the anointed, sisters and brothers of the anointed, and intimates of the anointed. And finally, the seminar also found 10 names of different groups in specific writings. Chloe's people, the way, the perfect day, siblings, the children, members, the order of Melchizedek, the altar.
Thank you for that. And we were thinking we would get through this about 8:25, or the 25 after the hour, but your work has really helped us much more. So thank you so much for that. I want to ask for some help. For next week is our last time to work on this book together.
Next month in February.
I want to just see if now probably we won't be able to get too much in by saying things, but I would love to hear from you on this. Some of the other chapters that we haven't covered are testing gender, testing boundaries, forming new identities through gender. This is one of the biggest things that we found in what people were doing. Belonging to Israel. In other words, since it's not a religion yet, to a certain extent, a lot of the people who are coming into these many groups say, well, Jesus was a part of Israel, so maybe we should begin to associate also in that way. Experimental families is another chapter. Join the club, meaning there are all kinds of different clubs in the ancient Mediterranean, and these people begin to be, quote, Jesus clubs. Feasting and bathing are things they do together. Here's another chapter, inventing orthodoxy through heresy. Demolishing Gnosticism as a topic. Paul obscured that chapter 15 we wrote because in the second century, Paul was not near as important as a thinker as he was in the first. So many of the groups think he's good because he formed a bunch of those groups, but they don't seem to think much of what he was saying. Jesus by any other names. This was a chapter that Shirley did much of the work on. And this here in the second century, what we found is there were a whole bunch of different ways that people thought about Jesus in the second century. Better Than a New Testament is the name of one of the chapters, and that is because there was no New Testament in those 2 centuries, and shows how much more those people, as we said earlier, basically talked together. And then the 20th chapter, the conclusion is a fairly strong focus on safety. So in as much as you want to let me know in the next 2 weeks at hal@haltaussig.org, or Shirley, you can also help us do that. Let us know which chapters you'd like to talk about next month. And secondly, I would want us to go back to where we started 3 months ago, and that is to begin to rethink how important are names and how important are identities that come from what people do. So my suggestion is you have kept pushing us tonight in really important ways, saying, follow up on what this kind of set of words mean in terms of what were they doing. Let's see. We've got 2 minutes left for anybody to make some thoughts, questions, or anything that you'd like to say critically.
I posted a question have we dealt with the issue of the controversy? And Shirley responded, I think his point was that it's just controversial to think there were no Christians then. That's controversial to mainstream Christians. But my problem is, just because they didn't use the word doesn't mean they were or were not Christians. So how is it just a matter of perception that makes it controversial?
That's what we found relative to the people who are critical of the book.
Okay.
So we don't know what to do with that, but one of the main things that books do is they help people think with one another or against one another. So yeah, I literally at the beginning I was meaning I want to hear from you all about how important that Christian word is or is not, and this has been very helpful.
Hal, I think somewhere along the line you want to mention something about those 3 uses of the word Christian in the New Testament, because we said we would cover that, and I know you've only got 30 seconds left.
Oh, that's
make a quick
right.
reference to
Yes.
that.
So yes, I think that Julio is the closest to right we can get, and that is because we have some letters between the emperor and a governor, in which the governor has found people and he's calling them Christian and trying to decide as a functionary of the emperor whether he should kill them or not. And so that it's not a real word. That is, it's kind of a made up word from the Christ word. That was also pointed out in the evening. So it seems to be that Christ is a word that has some political and social coinage. And so that means that the Roman emperor and governor need to be worried about them. And it could be in the 2nd century there, for instance, there are in the latter part of the 2nd century, there are groups that use the word Christian for one specific kind of thing that happens, and that is getting killed in the arena. So in other words, there we have some texts who say, is he a Christian? And what they mean is he going to get killed in the arena for being some kind of political or social group that is against Rome. So yes, that's now I just filled in some blanks that should be left hanging. But yes, those would be the 3 things to say.
And before we go tonight, I just want to thank Philip for giving us lots and lots of references throughout the evening tonight. He's been giving us translations and Bible references and page references. So Philip, special thank you to you for keeping us up to date on all these things you've been doing tonight. I want to thank you for that.
Yes, me too. Thank you.
I guess we better wrap up. It's been a rich conversation here tonight, Hal. You've kept us on our toes, and it sounds like we've got lots more to think about. So thank you, everybody, for your participation. This was the January 2022 textual study on the Bible and Beyond discussions on Were There Any Christians in the First 2 Centuries, led by Dr. Hal Taussig. Once a month from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday nights, generally the 4th of the month, we provide a discussion of one of the early Christian texts. Dr. Hal Taussig leads these sessions, sharing a well-framed overview of a particular text or topic and allowing participants time to ask questions and share their insights. As a reminder, we do rely on your donations to be able to produce these Zoom discussions. So if you're able, we especially appreciate a monthly pledge of support via Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Bible and Beyond to make a pledge that's just right for you. PayPal or check is also an option if you prefer. Check the website earlychristiantext.com for details. And we want to thank you so much for a wonderful evening.